which we read last week, "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." And then what follows is our passage for today. And I think this passage helps us understand how one's righteousness can exceed that of the Pharisees and the scribes. So we have in our reading for today from Matthew 4 of 6 sayings that are really antitheses. Jesus begins, "You have heard it said," and then he says, "But I say to you," right? You have heard it said, and he means you've heard it said from the law, that same law that he came to fulfill. And then he says, "But I say to you," tries to shift the perspective a little bit. See, I think what Jesus is saying here in a not so subtle way is the scribes and the Pharisees, they're living by the letter of the law. And indeed, that is righteous. But it misses the point of the law altogether. The law, or the covenant with God, right? And we know that it's more than the 10 Commandments, but we certainly know parts of it as the 10 Commandments. The covenant with God was never about simply following a set of rules, but as a covenant, a promise. It was a way of being in relationship with God and with others. So each time Jesus says, "You have heard it said, but I say to you," he is affirming that at the heart of the law is God's desire for right relationships. So obeying the law of God is about action, but it's also about what is in one's heart. And Jesus says to his disciples on the Sermon on the Mount that my followers obey God's law and then some. They take God's law to heart and then they live it accordingly. And living life according to the laws of God's kingdom will make my followers even more righteous than the most righteous people you can think of, Jesus says. And so he begins our reading for today by saying, "You have heard it said, you shall not murder." And then he goes on to say, "But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, 'You fool,' you will be liable to the hell of fire." Jesus kicks "you shall not murder" up a notch, doesn't he? By saying, not only shall you not murder, but you shall not even let anger get in the way of your relationship with another person. Jesus is telling his disciples, not only will you follow the law, you will follow the law and then some. You shall not murder, and you shall also not be so angry with another person that you even think, "I wish you were dead." Instead, you shall seek reconciliation. That's what this first one is all about, right? As Dr. Tom Long said, Jesus urges us, before you can open your mouth to sing peace like a river, do what is humanly possible to make peace with those around you. And so Jesus continues to give a new perspective on what it means to be a disciple who lives not only by the letter of the law, but by the spirit of the law, as he talks about adultery and divorce and swearing an oath. And each time Jesus says it is about the way your actions affect others that matters. And those actions should not inflict any harm. Those actions should engender respect and value for the other person. The actions should seek to restore relationships. What Jesus says to us as disciples is to live our lives out of an ethic that values the relationship we have with God and the relationships we have with other people. And it is still true for disciples today, these words of Jesus, right? Jesus' words speak to us still as we live our lives as a community of faith. Professor Caroline Lewis fleshes out this notion of living out of a life out of restoring relationships and valuing relationships, because she says the actions of your individual faith actually matter for the individuals sitting next to you in the church pew every Sunday, right? The actions of your individual faith actually matter for those of you you are sitting next to in the church pew every Sunday, so that what you do during the week might reflect or give witness to your fellow parishioner. That who you choose to be in the world is not only a revelation of yourself, but also a manifestation of those with whom you are in relationship or claim connection. You have heard it said, but I say to you, says Jesus. Now here's what it might look like in real life. There's a true story about two farmers in Canada. And one day the dog of one farmer got loose and killed some of the livestock of his neighbor. So that neighbor cut off all relationships with the farmer who owned the dog, and the two men lived in cold, defiant enmity for years. Then one day, a fire devastated the property of the dog-owning farmer, destroying his barn and all his equipment. He was unable to plow or to plant, and so his future appeared doomed. Except that, the next morning when he woke up, he found all of his fields plowed and ready for seed. Upon investigation, he discovered that it was his neighbor who he had a broken relationship with, who had done this good deed. Humbly, the rescued farmer approached his neighbor and asked him if he had plowed his fields, and if so, why? And the answer was clear from the other farmer. "I," the farmer replied, "I plowed your fields so that God can live." What we do in the world matters, not just to us, but to one another and to God. See, followers of Jesus knows what is required. We know what's required in the law. But a follower of Jesus goes beyond what is required in order that a right relationship should be restored. A follower of Jesus knows that the law is about love and grace and the power of forgiveness and reconciliation. A follower of Jesus values others. A follower of Jesus is as good as his or her own word. You have heard it said, but Jesus says to us, follow the law and then some. Amen.